Whispers spread among the prisoners, sharp and desperate. "This is some kind of trap," one hissed into the darkness. "They're waiting for us to let our guard down," another muttered, her words heavy with the fear that training had embedded in them. The code of Bushido had not prepared them for this scenario. The enemy lying peacefully within arm's reach. Their commanding officers had painted vivid pictures of American camps as places of systematic cruelty. Yet here, absolutely nothing was happening. The young medical worker, whose arm bore fresh bandages from earlier, pressed her face against the rough cotton pillow, concentrating on the sound of men breathing. They sounded weary, not threatening, but doubt clung to her chest like a physical weight. One soldier moved, rolling onto his other side. The scraping sound of fabric echoed like an explosion in the enclosed space. Every prisoner froze instantly, hearts hammered, but the man simply settled more comfortably into sleep, exhaling softly, seemingly unaware of the terror his simple movement had triggered. Minutes dragged by like hours. Some women kept their eyes forced open, monitoring the shadows. Others pretended to sleep but trembled beneath their coverings. No guard barked commands, no punishment descended. Only the steady, quiet rhythm of breathing filled the space. The silence itself became unbearable. It forced them to confront a possibility more disturbing than any violence, that perhaps everything they'd been taught was wrong. To accept that the enemy might be human was to betray years of conditioning, years of belief. Yet in the darkness, with nothing but steady breathing and stillness as evidence, the question refused to be silenced. The nurse turned her head slightly. Through the dim light she could make out one soldier sleeping with an arm across his chest, his face softened by exhaustion, looking vulnerable. He resembled less a monster and more like a brother or perhaps a farmer from her own village. Her heart pounded harder at this recognition, not from fear exactly, but from the terrifying realization that she had just seen him as human. She closed her eyes tightly, feeling ashamed, yet completely unable to erase what she'd seen. That night, sleep never came for her. She lay suspended between two realities, the one she'd been conditioned to believe and the one revealing itself before her eyes. And as the hours crawled past, her suspicion didn't simply fade. It transformed into something far more dangerous, genuine curiosity. What else might have been a lie? The first pale morning light filtered through the wooden slats. Roosters called faintly from somewhere nearby, their sounds mixing with the crunch of boots outside. The prisoners began to stir, rubbing at swollen eyes. The Japanese women rose with hesitation, bracing for harsh commands or punishment for some unknown transgression. Yet when they looked around, they froze in place. The American soldiers were still present, rolling up their sleeping gear, fastening belts, yawning like ordinary men finishing a work shift. Not a single one had touched any woman during the night. Not one had spoken a cruel word. They had simply slept, sharing the same space as though it were the most natural thing imaginable. For the prisoners, nothing about it felt natural. Their commanders had sworn the Americans would treat them like objects, worse than livestock. Yet here they were, waking beside men who looked at them without hatred, only the same drowsy fatigue shared by every soldier at dawn. One guard stretched his arms overhead, glanced toward the women and offered a small acknowledging nod before stepping outside. Another chuckled quietly as he pulled on his boots, saying something in English the prisoners couldn't comprehend. His tone, however, was crystal clear. It carried no hostility whatsoever. The young nurse sat on her platform's edge, staring at her own hands. She had braced herself throughout the entire night for violence, humiliation, or mockery. Instead, she had received silence. The absence of cruelty impacted her more powerfully than cruelty itself could have. Beside her, another woman whispered, "Why did they choose to sleep here with us?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Nobody could provide an answer. Breakfast arrived next, trays bearing eggs, bread, and steaming cups of coffee. The guards consumed the identical food, sitting alongside their captives. No special portions, no separation. The women stared in complete disbelief, their suspicion beginning to crumble with each bite. Still, unease persisted. Was this genuine kindness, or merely the opening move in some unseen game of cruelty? They had no way to know, but when the nurse lifted her cup, the bitter warmth of coffee sliding down her throat, she recognized something terrifying. She wanted to believe this was real. That morning the women exchanged glances, filled not with terror, but with profound confusion. They had survived the first night unharmed, and within that survival lay a new form of danger: doubt. Because if the Americans weren't the monsters they'd been warned about, then what else had been false? The war beyond the wire fence continued, but inside these walls, the greatest battle now raged within their own minds. The structure settled into a predictable rhythm over the days that followed. Each night, the Americans unrolled their sleeping gear on the floor planks, and the women returned to their platforms. Each morning, everyone rose together, the routine cycling like clockwork. Yet every repetition only deepened the strangeness. The women had prepared themselves for cruelty. Instead, they discovered themselves sharing silence, meals, and sleep beneath the same roof. Not once did a soldier so much as glance inappropriately toward the women. The shocking ordinariness of it gnawed at the captives. The nurse observed them with increasing attention. One soldier always removed his boots with care, placing them precisely at his side before lying down. Another slept curled around his pack, arms crossed defensively, his face looking almost childlike in the dim light. They didn't resemble predators. They looked ordinary. That realization was dangerous. To perceive them as human meant betraying everything she'd been taught. Yet each night, as the expected cruelty failed to appear, her certainty began to crumble. Still, trust didn't arrive easily. When one soldier coughed during sleep, a wave of panic shot through the platforms. When another shifted positions, several women froze in terror. But the moments passed harmlessly, and nothing occurred. The silence grew louder than words. It forced uncomfortable questions into their minds. If these men were truly their enemies, why did they sleep so vulnerably in the identical room? Why risk lying beside women they had captured? The answer remained unspoken, but increasingly obvious. The Americans didn't view them as threats. And in that quiet dismissal, there existed a strange form of respect. Recognition that they were human beings, not trophies of war. For the women, the contradiction became unbearable. They had anticipated brutality, yet received indifference mixed with fragments of unexpected kindness. The war had promised monsters. Instead, they found exhausted young men who simply wanted rest. The nurse lay awake one night, staring at the beams overhead. She realized that fear had transformed into something even more dangerous: curiosity. What did these soldiers actually think of them? Did they view them as enemies? Or simply as women caught in the identical storm of war? No answer materialized. Only the rhythm of shared breathing in the darkness. But for the first time, she found herself drifting into uneasy sleep, not from pure exhaustion, but from the quiet realization that perhaps captivity wasn't the ending she'd been taught to fear. It was something far stranger. A world where enemy and prisoner slept alongside each other, and the boundaries between them blurred slightly more each night. By the conclusion of the first week, the silence within the structure had transformed. What began as tension, thick and suffocating with fear, now carried an undercurrent of something different. An awareness that both groups were observing each other more carefully. The Japanese women whispered less frequently at night. Instead, their eyes tracked the American soldiers as they arranged their bedrolls. They studied how one man rubbed his temples before lying down, how another murmured a prayer in English, his lips barely moving in the dimness. The Americans also began to notice. They caught the quick glances from the platforms, observed how the prisoners' shoulders tensed whenever someone moved during sleep. Some of the soldiers exchanged knowing smirks, not mocking exactly, but amused by the nervousness that lingered despite so many peaceful nights. The nurse felt the weight of those glances more acutely than anyone. She remembered one evening when a soldier yawned, stretched, and accidentally met her eyes across the dim space. For a single heartbeat, neither moved. Then he smiled faintly, almost apologetically, before rolling over to face the wall. Her chest constricted. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't even dominance. It was simple acknowledgement. That small, fleeting smile unsettled her more profoundly than any weapon ever could. Around her, the other women whispered about their own observations. "They sleep exactly like we do," one said quietly. Another added, "One of them snores even louder than my father did." Brief laughter bubbled up, nervous but genuine. It shocked them as deeply as any kindness had. Each night transformed into a kind of wordless dialogue. The women listened to the rhythm of American snoring, the rustle of blankets, the occasional sigh of deep exhaustion. The men, in turn, seemed to sense the prisoner's fear gradually softening, though no actual words passed between the groups. This strange intimacy, born not from physical contact or conversation, but from simple proximity, strengthened with every passing day. They remained enemies, yet they occupied the same four walls, breathed the same stale air, shared the same fragile vulnerability that comes with sleep. For the nurse, it became unbearable. She wanted to maintain her hatred as she'd been taught and trained. Yet night after night, she found herself listening to their breathing, steady and undeniably human. And each time she did, her certainty slipped further from her grasp. One evening, as a soldier removed his boots and winced visibly at a blister, she caught herself thinking of her brother, who had marched barefoot across volcanic rock in the Pacific Theatre. The comparison stung deeply. She clenched her blanket and turned away forcefully. But the thought refused to leave. Enemies or not, these men weren't so different from the ones she had loved and lost. That realization haunted her more persistently than fear ever could, because in the silence of those nights, she understood she wasn't only surviving, she was beginning, against her will, to recognize the humanity of her captors. The sixth night started like all the previous ones. The soldiers filed in after completing their shifts, setting down rifles and bedrolls with the identical quiet routine. The women withdrew to their platforms, pulling blankets tightly around their shoulders, pretending not to observe. But something shifted that particular night. One soldier fumbled awkwardly with his equipment, dropping a small tin cup onto the wooden floor. The sharp metallic clang echoed through the structure, startling everyone into a frozen moment of silence. Then, completely unexpectedly, one of the women released a short, nervous laugh. It escaped before she could suppress it. A laugh born half from tension, half from the sheer absurdity of the moment. Her hand flew to cover her mouth in shock, eyes widening as though she'd just committed a serious offence. The soldier paused, looked down at the cup, then at her. Instead of anger, he grinned sheepishly, shrugged his shoulders, and retrieved it. To everyone's amazement, he gave a playful little bow, as if mocking his own clumsiness. The structure erupted, not in chaos, but in muffled laughter, first among the prisoners, then spreading even to the soldiers. For the first time, the two groups shared a sound that wasn't fear or suspicion, but something startlingly human. The nurse sat completely frozen, her heart racing. Laughter during captivity felt dangerous, forbidden. Yet she couldn't prevent the small smile pulling at the corners of her lips. It felt as if the air itself had transformed. Lighter now, less oppressive. After that night, the silence of the structure changed fundamentally. It no longer pressed down like a physical weight. Instead, it carried an undercurrent of possibility. The women began whispering less about danger and more about curiosity. The soldiers, too, seemed to relax visibly, their movements less guarded and defensive. Small moments accumulated. One prisoner sneezed in the darkness, and a soldier muttered something in English that sounded remarkably like a blessing. Another night, a guard hummed softly to himself, a tune unfamiliar to the women, but strangely comforting. Each gesture chipped away at the invisible barrier separating captor from captive. The women still feared dishonor. The soldiers still carried their rifles. Yet beneath those rigid roles, something undeniable stirred to life. Recognition. The nurse lay awake long after the laughter had faded into silence, staring at the beams overhead. She realized she was no longer waiting expectantly for cruelty. She was waiting for something else entirely, something she didn't dare name aloud. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to wonder whether kindness could actually exist even here, in the shadow of barbed wire fencing. The thought terrified her, because if kindness was truly possible, then everything she'd been told about the enemy might be fabricated lies, and that was more dangerous than any weapon could ever be. The following night, the air hung unusually still. Crickets sang beyond the wire, and the structure glowed faintly under lantern light. The women settled uneasily onto their platforms, while the soldiers unrolled their bedding on the floor, following the established pattern. But one soldier, young and broad-shouldered with sandy-coloured hair, did something completely unexpected. As he loosened his pack, he extracted a small leather wallet. Instead of tucking it securely beneath his equipment, he set it openly on the floor beside his bedroll. The Japanese women noticed it immediately. Their eyes widened in disbelief. A wallet, personal and valuable, probably containing money or photographs, left within easy reach of captives. It was absolutely unthinkable. Their own officers would have beaten them severely for such carelessness. The soldier appeared completely unconcerned. He stretched his tired muscles, muttered something to his companion, and lay down with his arm draped over his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing slowed into sleep. Whispers rippled urgently through the platforms. "It must be some kind of test," one woman hissed. Another shook her head slowly, watching the wallet gleam faintly in the lantern light. None dared touch it, but all felt the profound weight of what it represented. Trust. Or at minimum, the appearance of it. The nurse couldn't look away. She imagined reaching for it, imagined the soldier springing awake to punish her severely. But no such thing occurred. He slept deeply, seemingly unafraid, as though completely confident that none of them would betray his apparent carelessness. That gesture unsettled her more deeply than any rifle could have. It suggested that these men didn't perceive the women as enemies waiting to strike, but as human beings capable of restraint and honor. When morning arrived, the wallet remained untouched. The soldier picked it up casually, flipping it open to glance at something inside before tucking it back into his pack. For the briefest instant, the nurse glimpsed a photograph. 2 children smiling, their faces soft with youthful innocence. Her chest tightened painfully. This enemy, this soldier, carried reminders of home just as she carried hers in memory alone. Family, siblings, people worth protecting. He wasn't only a guard enforcing captivity, he was someone's son, someone's father, perhaps. The realization spread like wildfire among the women. The Americans weren't merely captors. They were men who possessed trust, who remembered loved ones, who carried pieces of love in their pockets. That night marked a genuine turning point. No one articulated it aloud, but every prisoner sensed it. The invisible barrier had cracked further, not through words, but through the simple, terrifying power of demonstrated trust. And once trust entered the structure, even in small gestures, nothing could make the world inside those walls feel identical again. It occurred on a night heavy with rainfall. Water drummed steadily against the roof, filling the air with a dull, almost soothing rhythm. The women huddled beneath their blankets, listening, while the soldiers shifted restlessly on their bedrolls. The nurse lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams when she heard it. English words, soft and uncertain, spoken closer than usual. A soldier was sitting upright, glancing toward the platforms. At first, she assumed he was addressing another guard. But then his words, halting and broken, reached her with perfect clarity. "You safe. No harm." The Japanese women froze completely. They understood minimal English, but those particular words were unmistakable. Safe. No harm. Their breaths caught simultaneously. The soldier hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. He seemed almost embarrassed, as if uncertain whether they had comprehended. Then, in an even quieter voice, he added, "Sleep." "Okay." The nurse's heart pounded violently. Nobody moved. Then, to her absolute astonishment, the oldest woman among them offered the slightest nod, clutching her blanket even tighter. The soldier exhaled softly, as though genuinely relieved, and lay back down. The silence that followed was unlike any previous night. It was no longer suffocating or filled with suspicion. It was heavy with the echo of words that couldn't be retracted. The nurse turned her head toward the soldier's shadow. She had prepared herself for cruelty, for threats, for humiliation. Instead, she had received reassurance. The dissonance was almost unbearable. Whispers spread once the lights dimmed further. "Did you hear what he said?" one woman murmured. Another whispered, "He told us we're safe." Their voices trembled with disbelief, as though speaking the words might somehow break the fragile spell. The nurse remained silent, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. She didn't trust easily, but the words echoed persistently in her mind regardless. Safe. No harm. For years she had believed capture meant shame, dishonor, the death of one's spirit. Yet here she was, being told by the enemy himself that she could rest peacefully. She closed her eyes, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. But eventually, sleep came more easily than it ever had during captivity, because for the first time, the silence of the structure carried not only suspicion, but the fragile beginnings of actual trust. Days continued to pass, but it was the nights that transformed most dramatically. What had once been unbearable silence, saturated with suspicion, slowly evolved into something different. The women still clung to their blankets, still avoided direct eye contact with the soldiers lying only feet away. But the tension no longer vibrated like a drawn bowstring ready to snap. It softened, thread by delicate thread. They began noticing small details. How the Americans always turned their backs when the women changed into their camp-issued clothing. How one soldier coughed quietly during the night, muffling the sound as if trying not to disturb them. The younger girls whispered about it in the darkness. "They're not like what we were told at all." The nurse listened carefully but offered no comment. Yet even she felt the slow erosion of her fear. One evening, a soldier set his rifle aside before lying down, resting it deliberately against the far wall instead of keeping it close. The gesture was unmistakable. It communicated, "I am not here to threaten you tonight." The women exchanged meaningful glances, their eyes wide with realization. For warriors raised under the strict code of Bushido, a weapon was a lifeline, an extension of oneself. To sleep without one within immediate reach was unthinkable, yet the Americans did so with remarkable calm, even ease. Gradually, the women came to a startling realization. The soldiers' presence had an unexpected effect. They felt safer, not protected from the Americans themselves, but from the unknown dangers beyond. Outside the wire, the night held countless threats: storms, hunger, disease. Perhaps even other men who might not follow the rules these particular guards seemed to follow. Inside, with these specific guards sleeping beside them, there existed order, predictability, even fragments of kindness. The nurse, lying on her narrow platform, found herself watching the rise and fall of a soldier's chest as he slept peacefully. His face, completely relaxed in the dim light, looked younger than she had initially imagined, almost boyish, vulnerable. Her thoughts startled her deeply. This was the enemy, yet he had bandaged her injured arm with care. He had spoken the word safe. And now, in this strange companionship of silence, he was simply another human being breathing through the night. Whispers of dreams followed in subsequent nights. One woman admitted she dreamed of home less frequently now and of the camp more often. Another confessed that the sound of American snoring actually comforted her, because it proved the men were human, not the monsters from propaganda. The nurse kept her own silence, but in her heart she knew something dangerous had begun. Trust, fragile and completely uninvited, was taking root. By the time the lights flickered out that night, the boundaries between prisoner and guard, enemy and protector, had blurred just enough for both groups to sense it. They weren't equals. They weren't friends. But they were no longer complete strangers either. Morning light spilled through the thin cracks of the structure, painting pale stripes across the floor planks. The women stirred first, adjusting blankets that still carried faint scents of soap and smoke. For a brief moment, they forgot their circumstances, the warmth, the quiet, the rhythm of steady breathing surrounding them. It felt almost like home. But then they registered the rifles stacked against the wall, the uniforms draped on nearby sleeping platforms, and the truth returned with crushing weight. The Americans rose slowly, stretching sore shoulders and rubbing at tired eyes. Their movements remained simple, unthreatening, almost domestic in nature. No harsh orders barked, no commands shouted, just men waking to face another day. The women exchanged glances once more. Something unspoken lingered between them all. They had survived another night, not drowning in fear, but floating in uneasy peace. The nurse, her arm still wrapped in the medic's careful bandaging, found herself whispering a single word under her breath. Alive. She hadn't realized until this precise moment that she'd stopped expecting to survive each successive day. But here she was, alive, adequately fed, and even safe. The soldiers also noticed the shift. They no longer saw eyes filled exclusively with suspicion. There were flickers of curiosity present now, even recognition. One soldier nodded at a woman as she sat up, and though she didn't reply verbally, she didn't look away either. Breakfast was announced. As the women moved into line, one of the guards muttered quietly to another, "They're starting to trust us finally." The words carried a weight he couldn't fully comprehend. For the women, the shock wasn't that the Americans had slept beside them. It was that the world hadn't collapsed because of it. Their honor remained intact. Their bodies were unharmed. Their dignity was strangely preserved. This realization proved more disruptive than any cruelty could have been. Cruelty would have confirmed the stories they'd been told repeatedly. Kindness challenged everything. When the nurse sat with her breakfast tray, she looked down at the eggs and bread, then at the men who guarded them, then at her own trembling hands. The world she had believed in before captivity was dissolving, piece by piece, like morning mist. The Americans didn't observe this internal turmoil. For them, it was simply another morning in another camp. But for the women, dawn had brought more than light. It had brought questions that would never fully leave them. How could enemies demonstrate such humanity? And if they weren't monsters, then what did that make the war itself? The answers wouldn't come that day, nor in the days immediately following. But the memory of those nights, when American soldiers slept beside them, not as conquerors displaying dominance, but as tired men seeking rest, would linger forever in their minds.